Hold on, hold on, hold on. Come on, Zoom, come on, Zoom. Come on, Zoom, come on, Zoom. YouTube, it's connecting, it's connecting. Done, okay. And you're live.
Okay.
You're live.
Good evening. You're listening to the new WCEG Network on WCEGTalkRadio.com. Live stream tab or watch us live on your smart TV, YouTube, WCEG Network. I'm Dr. Cassandra Wanzo, your show host of Mind Matters for the next hours. We're part of the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak life into the community. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio and at WCEG Network. Last but not least, the topics and opinions are those of the show host and guest and not WCEG Network. Thank you for your continued support. As I said, I'm Dr. Wanzo. I'm a practicing psychiatrist for the last 29 years in the Atlanta area. Our co-host is Officer Paul DesVignes, who has over 20 years of law enforcement experience. He's currently somewhere downtown near the CNN Center, so he may check in with us from time to time. But it's also his birthday, and I wanted to wish him a happy birthday. We have a special guest this evening, Mr. Norman Carter Jr. He's a retired Philadelphia police officer after serving more than 26 years. He's the author of The Long Blue Walk, My Journey as a Philly Cop. His extensive bio also includes military service, the Office of Inspector General, consultant in the hospitality industry, and lecturer on police corruption. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So glad you're here. Our topic this evening is I Just Want to Live, Racial Violence and Mental Health. But this evening we'll be focusing on the law enforcement aspects, whereas next week we'll focus more on the racism aspects. This past week, I have been sad and tearful, angry and exhausted. For so many of us, the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer kneeling on his neck for nearly 10 minutes, almost 3 minutes after his body went limp and unresponsive, was the last straw. He kept saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And he called for his mother twice. And he said, they're gonna kill me. Protests have erupted worldwide out of frustration and anger at yet another Black life being snuffed out for no reason. In 2020 alone, the following racial acts of violence have occurred. February 23rd, 2020, a vigilante trio in Brunswick, Georgia, chased down and shot 23-year-old Ahmaud Arbery, killing him. Mr. Arbery was unarmed and had not committed a crime. The three men were finally arrested after more than 2 months of freedom. The so-called citizen's arrest led by a former police officer. The tragedy was exacerbated by an apparent attempt by the local prosecutor's office to cover up the incident. March 13th, 2020, in Louisville, Kentucky, 3 police officers entered the apartment of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor to serve a no-knock warrant during a botched drug raid. They shot and killed her. No one has been charged with the crime. Miss Taylor was unarmed and killed while she slept after finishing her shift as an EMT. And then May 25th, 2020, a police officer kneels on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, 2 minutes and 53 seconds of which occurred after Floyd was unconscious, probably dead at the scene. One officer was charged, and today the charge was upgraded from second-degree murder manslaughter to, it was upgraded from third degree to second degree just this afternoon. And the other 3 officers were finally charged this afternoon with, the charges were aiding and abetting murder in the second degree, which is a felony. So that's what they were just charged. And one had already been arrested, and the others will be arrested soon. Mr. Floyd, age 56, was unarmed and was being arrested for the crime, a non-violent misdemeanor crime of allegedly attempting to use a counterfeit $20 bill. And he was in handcuffs. Finally, this weekend in Atlanta, a Spelman and Morehouse College student the car windows were smashed. They were forcibly removed from the vehicle. The male student was repeatedly tased and suffered a fractured wrist and received 23 stitches. 2 officers were fired, and arrest warrants have been issued for all 6 officers for charges ranging from aggravated assault, use of force, and damage to property. People, including myself and many people I know, are feeling numb, hopeless, angry, sad, traumatized, and tired. On Friday, the AMA, which is the American Medical Association, which is now headed by an African-American woman from Atlanta, Dr. Patrice Harris, has declared racism and police brutality a public health issue. So I'd like to get some feedback from you, Norman, in terms of your thoughts or feelings about all of this that's been going on as relates to the law enforcement and what's happening with these tragedies.
My first view of the murder of George Floyd on television, firstly, what was the guy doing with his foot on the shoulder? I mean, his knee on George Floyd's neck. Mm-hmm. But my outrage came from the police officers who were standing there who did nothing. Mm-hmm. Someone should have pulled that cop off of that man's neck. They stood there. That is just so horrible. And I'm not just saying this because I can say it, but I'm saying it because I lived that. There's a portion of my book, and I won't get into the whole story, where a Black female, about 40 to 50 years old, was brought into the police station in the trunk of a car. And the police officers thought that was funny. I was a rookie officer. I had maybe about 6-7 months on the job. Mm-hmm. My first instinct was to attack the cop that brought her in. Fortunately, I was grabbed by a veteran officer who pulled me back. But what we did, because she had to be further processed, is we stood by silently as that woman was properly processed and properly transported after that. You have to get involved. When you don't get involved, and I'm talking to my police officers, you are part of the problem, you're part of the crime. You can't think about, well, these are my buddies and I got to worry about what they're going to say if I do this. There's no wrong time to do the right thing. There's just no wrong time to do that. And there are instances throughout my career where I interceded and things like that. So to see how that happened. After a minute, and you hear the man saying you can't breathe, every police officer watched the video of what happened in New York, where the man said, I can't breathe, and he eventually died. I guarantee you, every police officer in this country saw that. So when that police officer heard that man say, I can't breathe, and he still stood on his neck for another 8 minutes, he knew exactly what he was doing. There is no training, absolutely no training in any police department that trains you to put your knee on someone's neck. That is not training. And it sort of bothers me when people say, well, they need to retrain their officers. That's not training. That is malicious intent to do harm. Well, I get too emotional with that. I hope I didn't go too far.
So there's nowhere where that is an official policy, neck restraints, anywhere?
No, you're taught to use whatever force is necessary to consummate an arrest. There are different degrees of force what you might use depending on the resistance that you face. But you had a man here who there is video evidence that he was not resisting. He was not resisting at all. He was handcuffed. He was in control. What you saw there was murder. There's no way to sugarcoat it. There's no, well, you know, I thought I was doing the right thing. They knew they were doing not only the wrong thing, but they knew who they were doing it to. And that is a problem that has to be corrected. I don't even know how we go about correcting that.
Okay. Paul, can you hear us, Paul? We see you.
Yes.
Paul?
I'm here.
Just wondering what your thoughts or comments about all these instances of violence and death.
Consider I'm right here in the middle of the whole protest at Centennial Marietta. It's important. You're going to hear the background noise of the demonstrators.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand and listen to what the people are saying so you understand how they feel about us at this time. So I'm going to give you video footage of the demonstrators themselves. Please pay attention to most of what they're saying in the signs.
So Paul, we can't make out what they're saying. Can you tell us what they're saying?
I'm sorry, say that again.
We can't hear what they're saying. Can you tell us what they're saying?
Well, I'm not talking at this time because it's important for you to listen to what the crowd is saying.
But what I'm saying, we can't hear them. So if you can tell us what they're saying, we can't hear what they're saying.
Okay. The crowds at this time are yelling, no justice, no peace. They're yelling for police reform. They're yelling for the end of brutality. And one of the things that's important in the last few days I've been out here is to notice that the diversity of the crowd is unbelievable. White, Black, Asian, Hispanic, East Indian, every racial group I can imagine, as well as age, from young, old, and everything in between is being represented. As a 24-year law enforcement veteran, I have never, ever seen such unity in demonstrations this size. Every night it has been ended with violence, crowd throwing rocks, sticks, bottles at us. And yet at the same time, I believe the biggest perpetrators of violence only make up about 20% of the crowd. The 80% are very, very, very good. They have interacted well with law enforcement personnel. They have been self-policing themselves to make sure that those instigators within the crowd do not spoil the protest. But I agree with the gentleman before and talking about how we witnessed what our peers have done to people. You know, when I came out of the academy, it was a us versus them mentality. And we did look upon acts of brutality and use of force as, hey, whatever it takes to get the job done. Unfortunately, at this point, it is not feasible anymore. We have to learn how to de-escalate. We have to learn how to talk better. Most importantly, we have to learn how to be a better part of the communities that we police. which means we have to get back to community policing. We have so much lost our sense of what it is to take care of community that it's kind of hard to sit there and know how to police it. I have the privilege of working with CNN concerning our safety of our crews, not only to understanding what's it like to be out here on one side of the law and watch demonstrators who have a very good point about what we have failed to do in terms of protecting and serving them. So, just out of curiosity, what do any of you think about the demonstrations themselves?
Well, I think protest is to call attention to what's going on, but then there's more that needs to be done beyond the protest. So I'm wondering from a law enforcement aspect, let me get the opinions, maybe, I guess, Mr. Carter, what can we do? What needs to be done to change things?
But I think that protests are really do serve a great purpose because it shows public outrage, but that public outrage has to be followed up by public action. And that public action is not only voting, but holding your public officials accountable. And one of the suggestions that I had in my book is that before we have problems, that we need to be greater participants in having open discussions with our police departments. Every police department, every police section should have monthly meetings where the community is invited. And then we have to go. We have to go, we have to participate. This is a way to not only air our grievances, but also to offer better ways of policing, to establish a necessary rapport between the police officers and the people in that community. That starts by actual sitting in a room, communicating, not yelling, communicating with each other. And I mentioned this in my book, and that's a very important step that's all too often ignored. And I think that's how we begin this talking to each other. And once we establish communications between the police officers and the people in that community, perhaps we look at each other differently.
Is that being done here? Is that being done any place that you know?
Well, I know here in Gwinnett County, where I live, that is done on a frequent basis. They frequently advertise coffee with a cop. That's maybe 2 or 3 times a month at different locations in Gwinnett County. They even have a program set up where people can sign up, civilians can sign up to attend seminars on how police are actually trained and what goes into police training. I think those 2 things are very, very, very important. And they need to be established in every community throughout the country. This is how we begin to alleviate these problems. This is also how we begin to weed out the officers who have a reputation of being brutal. As I said at some of my seminars, in the police department, nothing happens in a vacuum. You know who the hotheads are. You know who the guys are who are constantly bringing in prisoners with marks on them and scars on them, who have a long list of arrests and for minor offenses, but those offenses are always coupled with assault on an officer or resisting arrest. Those things can be looked at. Those are documented things. And the officers in those districts and those police departments, they know who the bad apples are.
So is there any kind of internal mechanism to change that? Or is it like the blue code or the culture? What's the issue?
I hate to say it, perhaps I'm a bad example. I was one of the active police officers who actually took advantage of our internal affairs unit. Almost all departments have them. And I went to the internal affairs unit to complain about activities of certain police officers. and I became the enemy. I became the target. And I went through 2 years of retaliation while I was on the job, and about 2 years after I retired. I document these in my autobiography.
Is that
So
part of the blue code? Is that part of the blue code?
That's part of the blue code. You don't dare tell on another cop, no matter what the offense is. And this is why it could be a reason why the cops you saw after that George Floyd was there with the foot on his neck, and why they stood by and did nothing. That is the personification of the blue code. That's it right there. I know he's doing wrong, but I'm not going to intercede. I'm not going to do anything about it because he's my coworker and I may need him to back me up on another job. So I'm going to be quiet, even though a man died.
So what can be done to change that? Is that's just the culture, or can that be changed?
It can be changed, but the first thing that the public has to do is you need to support the police officers who are the whistleblowers.
How can
Today,
how can the public know who they are and support them?
well, there are some. I can talk about specifically an incident in Philadelphia rather, where this happened just last year, where the police officers in the narcotics field unit were instructed to go out into the minority community, force known drug users to become informants. And if they refused to comply and be informants, they were instructed basically to find a reason to place them under arrest.
Wow.
And usually that would be on drug charges. So what happened is the African-American officers in that unit sued the police department immediately. They got together and sued the police department and says, we are not going to do this. Well, that received local media attention. It should have received national media attention. But there's a process within the system, our judicial system, even our media. We tend not to report this type of activity where officers take a stand, and they take a stand with the public that they serve. And this needs to change. This is how you change brutal cops. If I might run on for a minute, when I was a police officer, because people knew the type of guy that I was, when prisoners were arrested around me, there was never any cussing, there was never any brutality, because they knew that I wouldn't stand for it and I would say something. And we need more of that in our police departments. You don't have to go along to be a part of the system. People might not like you, but they will respect you. Better to be respected than liked, because when you don't do that, you see all kinds of abuses. We had, and I talk about this in my book also, where the police officers in the Philadelphia Highway Patrol Division were told, for every drunken driver arrest that you bring in, you get a day off.
What? Wow. So,
because there was a campaign by the Mothers Against Drunk Driving for police to get more involved in arresting drunken drivers. So what the police office, Highway Patrol unit did, this happened in Southwest Philadelphia. There's a bar at 56th and Chester. They had police officers in unmarked Highway Patrol cars sit outside that bar. And every black man who came out of that bar and got in his car, they waited till he got a couple of blocks away and they stopped him. And what you had is, happens in inner city neighborhoods, people will go in and have a drink and leave. Or a guy will go into a bar because there was no other place to do it. He would get a 6-pack of beer, put it in his car, leave to go home, and they would lock him up. So when this happened about 3 or 4 times, and the people were all middle-aged black men, I began to question it. So I brought this to the attention of my supervisor, because I was a part of the processing team. And I told my supervisor, these people, number one, they aren't drunk. And you have to sign off on the fact that you saw them being drunk. They are not drunk. These officers are lying, and they're bringing in innocent people and arresting them.
They didn't have to take a sobriety test, a field test, or any kind of.
They take the variety. Here's the problem. What counted was the arrest. It didn't matter whether they passed a sobriety test or not. All these people would have passed the sobriety test. They were just counting what was on the books, which was a fallacy in the system.
A breathalyzer even? They do a breathalyzer?
They do the breathalyzer later, as after process. That's about an hour after their process. So these officers were falsely arresting these people, getting credit for their arrest. And what happened is that it caused such a brouhaha when I brought this up that the officers stopped bringing the people into our district. And shortly thereafter, that practice stopped. But it took somebody speaking up to do that. And I'm no great hero. It's just that I joined the police department with a specific purpose in mind, because I saw what was happening in our communities in the 60s, the 50s, because I lived in a poor neighborhood. And I saw what the police did in those neighborhoods. And I wanted to be a vehicle for change. As idealistic as it may have been, I thought the best way to help my people was to be a part of the system that they hated. And I can't be a part of the system and do things for my people and ignore when my people are abused by other officers.
Paul, can you hear us? Paul?
Yeah.
Paul, can you, Paul?
I am here.
Yeah, we're talking about the blue code and the culture in law enforcement. Your thoughts about the blue code and the culture in terms of, not speaking up when there's something obviously wrong about the blue code. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with the gentleman, absolutely, positively. Police departments can be very fraternal in terms of keeping everything in-house. One of the things I do want to mention is saying the culture of an agency. Doesn't matter if it's local, state, or federal. One of the things everyone have to understand, an agency is only as good as its leadership. And when you start realizing that departments that have been led for so long are so bad, when you start looking internally, you discover that officer disgruntled, underpaid, mistreated. There's a lack of caring inside of the department for the personnel that directly correlates to the treatment of civilians out in the community.
Absolutely.
We have failed to police ourselves as time went on. We have always, well, when I came out of the academy in 1996, I was indoctrinated to believe it was us against them.
Yes.
If you could not use them hands, and that's what I think, not to say it's something to be proud of, but back then, shootings weren't what you really gained your reputation for. It's the ability to use them hands in a fist fight. The ability to be able to go into a crowd and handle a situation. And unfortunately, we have a lot of shootings now because you look at most agencies, you'd be amazed how out of shape the officers are. If they are out of shape and unprepared to do the job physically, imagine how bad they're going to be mentally. Leadership is extremely important because that sets the tone. It doesn't matter whether you're sheriff, your chief, or whoever the top dog may be. Those positions, how should I say, are disposable. Every 4 years or so, whenever there's a new mayor elected or a new president or a new whatever, from the FBI down, that new leader have the right, normally they do, to put heads of whatever agency they want. But the body stays the same. The culture stays the same. And unfortunately, law enforcement agencies are nothing more than puppets of your local, national, and state political system. When we start talking the acts of a police department, best believe they're carrying out the wishes of that local legislator. Whoever your representatives are on a local level, your mayors, your city council personnel, your local, what do they call them, aldermans. I mean, these people dictate a large part of what the police do or how they do it and who they do it to. You know, think of a firearm. Everyone fears a gun, but a gun is harmless until a human put their hands on it.
Mhm.
Police department is the same way. It is a tool that was meant for public safety, but when it's used the wrong way by political leadership, then it becomes a weapon of mass destruction. And it's important to focus on that. Again, it is a tool. We have failed to make our legislators, representatives, and elected personnel live up to their job. We have failed to have them be accountable themselves, because when you get accountable leaders, you get an accountable law enforcement agency. You get accountable personnel, you get accountable police. Most importantly, you get accountable citizens as well. There's no such thing as resolving this situation by attacking one part of it and saying, well, if they fix themselves, everything else will be all right. It's not going to happen that way. Everybody has an obligation to look at what they contribute to the negative part of our society and start working together to change that. And until that happens, we're still going to have situations like this.
But
it's going to be different.
You said the culture remains the same. What can be done to change the culture? You said no matter who's there, the culture is the same. How can you change the culture?
That's been $1 million question. How are we going to change the culture? That's the $1 million question. And here it is, it's 2021. I'm sorry, we're in 2020 in the 21st century, and we still going through the same situations. You know, again, law enforcement have been used as a tool throughout history for those in power to oppress, brutalize, and most importantly, keep what they consider to be their law and order. When that change you're talking about have to be a legislative change. It has to be a leadership change. It has to be we the people take responsible for their actions, government, individuals, communities, as well as better education on our part to say, hey, listen, there's nothing we're going to be able to achieve individually. We have actually come together to be able to resolve things and make it better.
Mr. Norm, do you have any thoughts on changing the culture?
Well, my first thing is communication, and that's talking from the police to the community. The other thing that I think is far too often ignored, and I've been out now for several years, and Paul DesVignes, Officer DesVignes is right there, is your legislators need to talk, have more conversations with the cop on the street and not so much the commanders, because that is a part of the process that is often left out. And what happens is a policy, as I mentioned about the incident where the Mothers Against Drunk Driving wanted more police involvement in arresting drunken drivers. By the time that gets down to the cop on the street, it's whatever you can do to bring people in and charge them with drunken driving is what you need to do. The message changes. So that is part of the culture. There has to be a culture change, but it starts from the bottom. It has to start on the bottom, but also it's the leadership.
You mean the bottom? It has to start in the bottom. What do you mean?
Well, the bottom means your initial training and indoctrination at the police academy. And there's a great amount of indoctrination that goes on in the police academy, because what is fostered, in addition to teaching you the laws and teaching you policies, is teaching you it's us against them.
And that's still the culture?
Yes, that's still the culture. When you go to and we had a fraternal order of police in Philadelphia, I don't know what they have here, but when you go to that first fraternal order of police meeting, what is said to you is, we're all blue. Not true. But we're all blue. There's no black, there's no white, we're all blue. But then what you see on the street and in practice is something else. So there has to be a number one, the culture change. And I heard a politician say this the other day, is that we need more people in the communities that look like us. Well, in addition to looking like us, they have to act like us are precious, like us are on the same level as they are. So you can't talk about having police officers who look like us, but who don't have our interests at hand. And that's a matter of training. There needs to be community involvement in the training of police officers. They need to go out and sit with the communities. We need to have programs where police officers are actively involved in playing baseball and basketball games with these teenagers in the community. The female officers, same thing. There are things that all of us can do with getting actually involved in the community and becoming a part of that community and making the community feel like we're there to protect them.
Did y'all see the video of those officers somewhere in the East Coast doing the Cupid shuffle with the protesters?
Yes, yes, that's the type of involvement you need. It works.
About people that look like us. You know, the incident, I don't know if, did y'all both see the video of the incident of the Howard and Spelman students, Officer Paul?
Yes.
Norm, y'all saw that? What was interesting is most of those officers were African-American, and they said they had undergone cultural sensitivity and use of force training. So what happened?
Yes. You know, there's a big section in my book where I talk about that cultural training. We had human relations training in Philadelphia. And what happened is that training was supposed to be monitored by the police department. It was done by professors or instructors from Temple University. But what happened is, though the police department was supposed to have supervisors monitoring that training, they never sat in the room. So a lot of the classroom time was spent with the police officers telling that civilian instructor that they didn't know what they were talking about. You don't know how it is on the street. This is what we have to do. So in the training, the police department, yes, we need people in the community to assist in doing the training, but the police departments have to be more involved in that training. They have to support that training and not just give lip service to it. And I think that's, to say these officers went to that sensitivity training, it doesn't suffice it if the department itself is not supporting that training. It's just paperwork. So because there's no way you can go to that type of training and come out and do what these officers did to those Spelman and Morehouse students.
Did both of y'all undergo that type of training, cultural sensitivity and use of force?
I did, yes.
Paul? Paul?
I can hear you, go ahead.
Right, so did you undergo cultural sensitivity and use of force training?
Probably more time than I want to admit it. I mean, that turned out to almost be an annual class, to be honest with you.
All officers do that? Do all officers do that?
Well, let me just say this. Agencies and jurisdiction did it simply for CYA.
See, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
They can really care about what, I mean, it just looks good public liberation wise to say, yeah, you know, like I'm a CIT officer, crisis intervention, trained to work with people with mental health. You know, when the CIT program came about, first of all, none of us knew exactly what it was. You know, as a street level narcotic officer in a crime suppression unit, I was like, hey, go take this class, see what it's about. That's how I ended up. It was so funny. We talking back in 2003, 2004, somewhere that along the lines. You know, President Bush, the second one, said, hey, 20% of all law enforcement are going to be CIT certified to be a better officer in the community, people with mental health, so they could become better police officers. Yeah, well, it sounds good. We probably killed more people with mental health issues since then than we did before.
Wow. Mm.
But as the gentleman stated, you know, police departments are only as good as the people. And I spent, 3 years at the academy as an instructor. And, you know, I got in a lot of fights. One thing I wanted to interject earlier, as he stated, in regards to weeding out bad apples, you know, especially in the inner city high crime area, you really gotta really differentiate between a very good streetwise aggressive officer versus a bully in a uniform who picks on the weakest. And if you want to see an officer, if they have the same number of complaints, let's say 25 complaints for use of force. You look at the cases those complaints came on, or the individuals the force was used against. If they came from dope boys in some of your worst areas who have a history of fighting the police or firearm violations, then okay, that's an aggressive officer kicking ass. Don't think perps are stupid, because they'll use complaints and all that stuff on you too to try and get you removed, transfer, or out of an area because you're too good an officer.
Okay.
But then focus on the officers who get a lot of complaints, but yet jaywalking, you know, public urination, public intoxication. You start looking and saying, hold it, wait a minute. All these complaints are really petty crap. And you start looking at how many are actually involved in these complaints of the fights and everything, and you quickly start to realize that's where your problem comes from. You start to say to yourself, where did we go wrong in terms of that? Make sense?
Right. The officer in Minneapolis had 18 complaints.
The officers that's assigned to any unit at any time, the worst of your worst will always be the ones who are quick to jump in when it's 2, 3, 4 more on one person. But I'm telling you, every community, especially in the city, you need a badass unit. You need a unit that it's like pit bulls. You find targeted areas, whether it's drug gangs, whether it's street level narcotics, whether it's burglary groups, and you let that unit go. You cannot have I'm so clean and nice of a department that you now become your own worst enemy because you can't solve a crime. That's the reason I have problems with departments that do a lot of traffic enforcement. Houses are getting broken into. We have an entry in all those home invasions, business getting robbed, but you're making hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars on traffic tickets. Again, the culture and philosophy of that agency has a lot to do with who's running it as well. And if you do not set an agenda legislatively by your elected officials on review panels staffed by civilian members of the community, you are always going to have a department that operate as is will, because orders that are passed down will eventually get so muddled up, you have discretion to literally do whatever you want to do.
Speaking of community review boards, like I belong to the Organization of Black Psychiatrists. Every organization has issued a statement, but one of the things that they issued in our statement of Black psychiatrists was having citizen review boards. Is that something that happens often, or is this very rare?
Well, keep in mind, boards. It's difficult for me because they have the helicopters and all the other stuff that's out there going right now. And unfortunately, it is going to be loud, but also keep this in mind. You got to look at your police agencies or law enforcement regardless of federal, state, or local, as a tool. Stop looking at them as a separate entity that can do whatever they want, where they want. And I think that's the perception that average civilian or citizen have. Or the department can do whatever they want. That's not the way it works. Even if we make mistakes, even if we abuse authority, even if there's excessive force, still, even within that department, there are guidelines that must be followed. Yeah, there's a code of blue, absolutely. Just like every fraternity and sorority has their bylaws and their cultures. If you're a Mason, there's a bylaws, there's a culture. If you're an AKA, there's some culture, there's bylines, there's rules of what you can and cannot do. At the end of the day, we all have something and somebody to answer to, regardless of what we do outside of those processes. Policy and procedure is everything. where they get messed up when you bring in human nature. Every agency has a mission statement. Why? Because it looks good when you come into the headquarters. It looks good to read the words and it sounds good to the average person. Say, yeah, you know what? They're really professional. They're on top of their game. They are good. No, we're not. A mission statement is all of that. It's just a piece of paper, words that written on it that somebody says, hey, you know what? This makes us look good. And gentlemen said before, you know, the best way to really go in and really start changing and making the department better, you start with the officers, line officers. You start at the very bottom. And if I come in as a new chief, I don't want to listen to whoever supervisors, commanders, or majors, lieutenants I got. Why? Because no matter, even though I'm chief, I'm going to have to fight to change their philosophy to get them to understand how I want this department run. If I want to start rebuilding a bad department to a better one, I'm going right to the bottom. I'm going to my front troop. I'm going to my patrol unit. I'm going to those who've been on these lines, who've been officers for 20 years. I'm going to say to him, listen, why haven't you not advanced in this department? Or if you turn out to be someone who's a rookie and you fresh, I'm going to ask you, why are you still in this department? What do you like and what you don't like about it? And I'm going to listen. And I'm going to listen. I'm listening for common things and problem, issues, and concerns. I'm not going to get the truth out of my command staff or the command staff that was left over from the last chief of sheriff, but I am going to get the truth from those basic officers on the front line. I'm going to find out who the good supervisors and who are not. I'm going to find out who the commanders who really shouldn't be commanding anything. And then when I start my reform, I'm going to start my reform at the top, not down at the bottom. I'm not going to force officers to do anything their own supervisors and commanders won't do. And I think that makes sense. And the public, once you really start understanding that, hey, if you don't value your police agencies and you don't communicate, interact with, if you don't take the time to invest in the getting to know and demanding a better product, then technically you deserve what you get. It's community empowerment on all sides. Please don't make the mistake of thinking police departments are going to clean up themselves. It don't work that way.
So I was asking about the community review boards. What about the community review boards?
Community review boards is just that. Most don't have the power to hire, fire, make. All they can do is make a recommendation based upon what they hear. But what's important for a community review board is to start building a relationship with your law enforcement agents. It's not about you trying to discipline or control it, but start a communication. As the gentleman said, you know, every agency works within the community. That's our jurisdiction. Once upon a time, we knew everybody who lived in the community. We knew the businesses in the community. We invested in the community. We were a part of the community. You know, it's different to have a white officer policing a predominantly Black neighborhood, especially if they're biased, scared, racist, or anything else. No different than you putting a Black officer in a affluent white community. How does he not be made to feel like he's just a pawn of the system? They treat him like they're entitled to it. His job is to do whatever they want. And most importantly, they'll tell you in a heartbeat, you don't do, if you even remotely think you're going to lock me up or write me a ticket, let me call so-and-so, the mayor, the chief, the commander. See, they go to the very top. And before they even finish that call, you coming on the radio, hey, just go ahead and code 8 from that. Don't worry about this one, it's good. So is that morally right? See, even those who make the laws, even the ones who are supposed to be leaders and examples, at their discretion, break the law and determine who gets the enforcement and who don't. Okay. So again, the bottom line is policing still is a product of the very community that it protects. There's no super place or law enforcement officers are created. We're no different than anybody else. They got mental health issues, got substance abuse issues, got bills, got problems in their life, got domestic related issues. It's all people. But at some point, if you want a better product, you have to start investing more into your agency to get it.
Okay, and Norm, what are your thoughts? Do you have any thoughts or comments about it, Norm?
I do, and I'm going to bring up, if you don't mind, I'm going to quote from my book, my autobiography, from the epilogue. It's just a short quote, but it says, "I have always revered my chosen profession as a police officer. Despite all the turmoil this profession gave me during my career and after my retirement, I still revere it. Being a police officer is an occupation with a built-in opportunity to be a guardian of one's community. Unfortunately, as with bad teachers, bad doctors, and bad politicians, it is difficult and almost impossible job to dispose of the bad apples, the shortcutters, those who are handicapped by a severe lack of integrity, and those who hide their heads in the sand while wrongdoing goes on around them, keep a black cloud over the men and women of law enforcement." And to answer your question, we do need civilian review boards. We need civilian review boards with authority, with subpoena power. That's what you need. And you need civilian review boards who are open to bringing in retired police officers or retired law enforcement officers to give them a little bit of insight as to what is going on, because you cannot be a group of civilians and begin to make an assessment without some input from people who had been part of that system that you can trust.
So how do you get a review board that has that authority? How do you get that kind
That
of board?
goes back to what Officer DesVignes was saying. It begins with your legislatures. This is something that they have to do. We need psychiatrists on that board. We need law enforcement, retired and law enforcement people on that board. We need physicians. We need a legislative representative on that board. And perhaps we need even a former prosecutor on that board, so that there could be other people involved from the community, but you have to have input from those people to be able to look at situations and make just decisions. And those people, that organization needs to have the support of the district attorney's office, the executive members of the Philadelphia, of any police department. They have to have the support, and they have to have subpoena powers. And that subpoena power means they can subpoena police reports. Very important. They can subpoena, today we have body cam video. They could have the authority to subpoena those things. Without subpoena power, they're going to be ineffective.
Do any of such boards exist in the Atlanta area?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. And when you say Atlanta area, I know it doesn't exist in Atlanta.
Okay.
But when you start branching out, the problems in Atlanta are not necessarily the problems in certain other areas of the state. So I'm sure, and I can do some research on it, that there have to be some cities that have civilian review boards with that type of support from their community and from their legislators, but I have to check that out.
Okay.
But that's what's required.
Okay. Now, Officer Paul mentioned like those officers who say that the bullies. So what is done in terms of like recruiting officers, in terms of psychological testing, personality testing? Is that done? It
is done, but there are certain personalities that don't come out until they're in certain environments. And where things might, I don't think that the psychological testing, at least it wasn't when I came on, was sufficient. It's an effort, but are we just doing paperwork and lip service to it, or are we actually doing a in-depth psychological background on the people who are coming in. So I don't know whether that's done. There are people who I've seen come on police departments who you always wonder, how did this guy get on the job? You know, if they're giving psychological tests, how did this guy get on the job?
Right.
So
I wonder how extensive they are, because the tests can show like severe personality disorders, and those are the kind of people that you wouldn't want on the force with severe personality disorders.
But Dr. Wanzo, what also you have is politicians using their influence to get certain picked people on the department. That happens. And these people are not always the best people.
Wow.
It's a dirty system sometimes, and when you're not vigilant in your hiring process, these are what happens. The people are murdered. I have statistics here. We don't have time to get into it, but it's a situation that can be fixed. We can't throw up our hands and say, this is it, this is the way it's always going to be. It can be fixed. I have shown that the way to go about it, I've detailed that, but it's community involvement. It's a willingness on the police departments themselves to change, not necessarily to change the training, but to change the culture. That has to happen.
We keep getting back to the culture, and it seems like
Yes.
that's the big issue. How do you
But the
change
culture is determined by the people at the top.
Okay.
Quick example. A person was raped when I was a rookie. A lady was raped in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. The person was apprehended. They had him standing in the police station. Frank Rizzo, who was then the police commissioner, came into the police station and said, this is your rape victim? This is your rape suspect? And they said, yeah, that's him. He said, and he looks like this. And Frank Rizzo began to beat this guy up. And when he finished it, he said, this is how you treat rape victims. Case in point, 2 years later, I'm on the job.
Wait, this is the victim? The victim they beat up?
He beat up the perpetrator.
Oh, okay.
For no reason. A year later, I'm on the job. We arrest a rape suspect. The officers who, from that same district, who made that arrest began to beat on this guy.
Wow.
The sergeant jumped in and said, what did this man do to you? That stopped the beating. And so when we say culture change with people like that, like my Sergeant Johnson or other people who jump in and say, we're not tolerating this, but it has to be done. It can be done. And it's not a matter of, you cannot throw up your hands and say, this is the way that it is, or just take it. You can't. You have to speak up. You have to let it be known. And it doesn't require you to do anything grandiose. As I said before, people knew not to do certain things around me. That's all you need. You just need one person.
Okay.
And if you can get 5 people in a police unit to be that way, we can't do that around him. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to change your personality. But what I am doing is changing your behavior while you're on that job.
Okay. Behavior modification.
That's what's needed.
Behavior modification.
There you go.
Okay. Well, this has been very enlightening, and I really want to thank you for agreeing to come on. So thank you so much for participating in the program.
I didn't have time to say happy birthday, but
Paul, I don't know if he's still around, but happy birthday, Paul.
happy birthday.
He's working on his birthday. So
Yes.
this is the end of this discussion, but we're going to continue next week, and we're going to probably focus more on mental health aspects of racial violence.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you, Dr. Wanzo. You have a great program. Thank you.
All right, to all our listeners, thank you for joining in, and we look forward to you joining us next week. And thank you again, our special guest, Mr. Carter.
Thank you.